The Minecraft player has a dark secret. Not all that long ago, the overworld was ruled by a ruthless group of dark magic wielders, known as the illagers. However, after a massive defeat recently, most of the illagers were killed, with only the lucky few remaining. And due to that, the control that the illagers had once had over the world was beginning to crumble. And in the midst of that, an opportunity arose, where the old enemies of the illagers could rise once again. Most notably though, were the villagers, who had been hiding in their tiny towns for decades, trying to stay safe from the illagers' constant attacks. But now, with the illagers weakened, these villagers started to leave their towns and they began on constructing massive cities. They hoped that with these cities, if they were defended enough, they could keep the illagers out and have an eternal peace. However, the illagers who watched on from their mansions thought that these villagers had a different goal with their cities, mainly that they were planning on attacking. And all of that angered the illagers. Not just because they couldn't attack back at this moment and that these cities would be impossible to destroy once they were created, but also because they had spent so long trying to rule this land, only for it to be taken over by their mortal enemy, the villagers. However, there was very little that they could actually do at this time, as they were just far too weak. But was there really nothing they could have done? You see, while the illager group may have been massively down on their numbers, those still around still had those high intelligence levels that they had used to be able to conquer the world. So surely they could think of something to overcome this new threat. And that's when they had an idea. The zombies. Now, the zombies could infect a villager with a viral disease that corrupted them. And once one villager had this disease, they all would. And so the cities would be destroyed from the inside. But a major problem with using these zombies was that they were very easily killable. But that could all be fixed by using some simple magic by the evokers. However, as the evokers hadn't experimented with a zombie in quite some time, the results from their experiments were going to be, well, interesting to say the least. At first, there was some major success with their experiments, as they were able to make the zombie very powerful. In fact, this magic zombie was so powerful that it could kill any non-boss mob with just one hit, and it could infect the villagers much easier. Also, it had a much higher defense, having almost 20 hearts, which made it almost impossible to kill, even if the villagers spotted it. Sounds like a great weapon for the illagers to use, except there was a tiny problem. This zombie was huge, in that it was the height of almost 2/3 of their entire mansion. Now, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but that did mean that it wouldn't be able to go in any small places. But that probably wouldn't be an issue. Anyways, that modified zombie, due to its massive size, was known from then on as the Giant. And so the illagers sent out their giant to the cities that the villagers were making in an attempt to end them. And they were very successful in that mission, as they were able to infect all the villagers of every city with their virus without being killed. And then afterwards, the other illagers would come in and burn the cities down, leaving no traces of their city behind. However, some of the villagers were able to escape these cities and flee to their old villages without being infected. But that wouldn't be all that bad for the giant, as it could just chase them up to their villages and destroy them there. But that's where its massive size came at a massive disadvantage, as the villagers were able to squeeze into small areas that the giant just couldn't reach. And so although the giant had flattened out the entire village, the villagers could stay safe in small hideouts, and eventually those villagers would start attacking the giants, and after quite a while, they even killed that massive beast. Now, that pained the illagers quite a lot, as that giant was their final hope to rule the world, as they had now become even weaker than before, and they now didn't have the energy to create another giant. And well, the villagers were planning to take advantage of this, as they started to march towards the mansions with the intent of ending all the illagers, and ending this brutal conflict that had been going on for far too long. Now, the illagers were terrified, as there wasn't a lot they could do other than watch these villagers starting to arrive, as individually they were all far too weak to fight. It was going to be their end. Or would it? As in a moment of haste and desperation, the illagers gathered all the magical items they had, from the remains of the giant to enchanted tools and weapons to the totems of undying, anything that they could get a hold of. and they combined all these items using one of their darkest spells to create a new living being. Now, because that was a dark magic spell of just pure evil, there was a cost, and that was that a majority of the life force and magic of the casters of the spell would now be tied to the new being. But that shouldn't be too much of a worry, if that creature was going to be obedient to its creator and was very powerful, which it was both. An example of this creature's power was that it had the strength to break an entire tree with its bare hands, or more impressively, to break obsidian with its bare hands. In fact, this creature was so powerful that it could even bear the weight of an entire mountain if it so desired to. So it was very powerful, more so than that giant. Also, another difference from that giant was that this creature was much smaller, around the same size as the villagers, so there would be no hiding from it. Also, it possessed all the knowledge of the illagers, and it wore the clothes of the giants. And so it was going to be the perfect weapon against the villagers. Hence why it was known from then on as the superpowered terrestrial eager villager racer, or Steve for short. But there was no time to marvel at the wonders of the Steve, as the villagers were getting closer and closer, and so the illagers sent the Steve out on its first mission, a mission to kill all of the invading villagers, which it did very quickly, and then it returned back to its leaders, where it was given another new mission: hunt down every single villager until none were remaining. So, over the course of the next few years, the Steve would travel across the world, burning down every village it came across, leaving no survivors. And so it looked like, once again, the illagers were going to rule the world, and the villagers were going to have to stay in constant hiding. But then, something very strange happened. The Steve began to develop emotions, and a mind of its own. And with that, he had a realization that what he was doing was wrong. He shouldn't be attacking these villagers. They were defenseless creatures who just wanted a home and they wanted peace. And so, filled with the regret of all of his actions, the Steve offered help to the villagers. Now, initially, the villagers were very skeptical of this, as they thought it was an obvious trap set by the illagers. But eventually, they did realize that Steve truly had changed, and as such, they accepted him into their group, where he would help them make much more defended villages, with buildings made from stronger stones, and he would also help them develop more specialized skills. Overall, the Steve helped in creating a much stronger area for the villagers, and in return for all of that, the villagers would offer the Steve many different trades, all in exchange for the rare illager mineral known as the subscriber old. The emeralds. And the villagers wanted this just so that they could show the illagers that they were no longer scared of them. In fact, they were winning against them. Meanwhile, the illagers were watching all of this from their mansions, both confused and angry, as the Steve wasn't meant to be teaming up with the enemy and helping them, and those emeralds were meant to be all theirs, not the villagers. And well, they just couldn't have that, and so they casted their final spell, a spell that made all mobs of all the dimensions aggravated against the Steve. However, as the illagers were in a much weakened state at this point, not all the mobs were affected by this, as the very strong-minded and the very weakened-minded weren't fully affected. Regardless of its failure though, the illagers hoped that it would cause enough stress to the Steve, due to the constant hunting that it would now have to endure, that it would transform back into the heartless warrior it once was. And well, it did scare the Steve a lot, but it didn't change the Steve as the illagers thought it would. As instead of being reverted into a heartless soldier, the Steve became even more compassionate for the villagers, and it was desperate now to not put them at any risk by staying by them. And as such, he set up a plan of self-banishment. But before he would do that, he had a few important things to do. First, he helped improve the iron golems, placing some of his own powers inside the machine to keep the villagers safe from any aggressors that enter the village. And second, he taught the villagers about enchantments, a dark art used by the villagers to make armor and tools more powerful. And once he had done that and felt like the villagers were safe, he left them for good, and he ventured into the center of the world, where he banished himself and was put in an eternal sleep. Now, that may sound bad, but really that meant that all the illagers' powers were now put to sleep, because they were tied to the Steve, and so they became very weak, and would now have to hide in their mansions in order to stay alive, which meant that there could finally be peace in the overworld, until you awaken. Because you are the Steve, and when you reawaken, the illagers' dark powers return. But where did these dark powers even come from? Well, they have a long, dark history, and it all began with the end of the dark. But you'll need to watch this video to find out how it all began.